Andrew Putnam is the Superintendent of Urban Forestry and Landscapes for the City of Cambridge. He's a Massachusetts certified arborist, NOFA accredited organic land care professional, and a track certified. He has 20 years of experience in the field of arboriculture and has worked at the City of Cambridge for 7 years. Anita Roy Dobbs is a team leader at Forests for Watertown, an all-volunteer baby forest was planted in October of 2024. She is growing the core volunteer team to hold art and science events at the forest, host community conversations in Heat Island neighborhoods, and give presentations about the Miyawaki Method, and get to know each of the forest's 700 plus trees and shrubs. Beth Sudemeyer is a planner for the Devons Enterprise Commission, supporting the sustainable redevelopment of Devons, which is a former military base turned model for sustainability. She's experienced in municipal permitting, open space restoration, and active transportation planning. Beth was previously an environmental planner with the town of Sudbury and has worked for the state in various capacities. She has a passion for rewilding and raising awareness about the importance of native plants and eco-restoration. Bram Gunther is the Vice President of Science and Development at Planet Wild, where he leads programs like the Wildra system to measure rewilding impacts. He previously served as Chief Forestry, Horticultural, and Natural Resources for New York City Parks, co-founded the Natural Areas Conservancy, and serves on the board of Hilltop Hanover Farm, a sustainable farm and native plant nursery in Westchester, New York. Walter Kitteridge is the ecology advisor and founder of Oak Haven Sanctuary Nursery in North Reading. He has supported numerous Miyawaki groves and pollinator gardens as an advisor, donor, and participant. He was previously the senior curatorial assistant at the Harvard University Herbaria and the assistant curator of the New England Botanical Society Herbarium, and is currently a board member of the Friends of Harold Park State Forest. Walter works with the Avis ecosystem on habitat restoration and has conducted floristic inventories across eastern Massachusetts. He co-authored Changes in the Flora of the Middlesex Fells Reservation. What a panel! All right, we're going to get started. We thought we'd start with the beginning, preparation. And the first question is probably aimed for you, Andrew. From a municipal perspective, what are some of the biggest hurdles in securing land for a mini forest project? And how do you make the case to balance them with other demands like sports fields and open space when you're advocating?
I think Cambridge is somewhat unique in that it's very densely urban area compared to some other municipalities. So this isn't a blanket experience for all municipalities, but in Cambridge, it feels like every square inch that's in the public realm is fought over for different programming needs. And so it's a matter of getting somewhat creative, defining locations, and just working with relationships with other departments. For the Green and Rose forest that the tour bus saw last weekend, we worked with the Arts Council actually to have an outdoor sculpture that had been there for a decade moved to a better location. So it's about some of the relationships I have in the municipality and then finding slightly underutilized locations. And making the case has been easier with the success of the Miyawaki forests and the public support and engagement all around. It was really an easy discussion with the Arts Council because the artists themselves had participated in the Miyawaki Forest, and the director of the Arts Council was just enthused by the one at Danahy. So that made my life easier. And then other locations, I'm campaigning during capital projects, whether they're parks being rebuilt or larger scale projects to carve out 1,000 square feet and those things. So it's just an ongoing advocate for space condition in Cambridge.
Does anyone else have a view, or have you experienced any pushback from planners or neighbors, politicians, and how did you deal with that?
I'll just speak from our municipal perspective as well. I'm Beth, and from the Air Devon's Pocket Forest Project. So we're located in north central Massachusetts and about 35 miles outside of Boston. And our projects have all really been driven from the standpoint of resiliency planning within the communities. We've taken advantage of municipal funding that we've been able to get through the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Grant Program at the state of Massachusetts. And so for municipalities in Massachusetts, this is a great opportunity. But after going through a number of iterations of climate action planning and planning for nature-based solutions, we landed on the idea of installing pocket forests. Now, each of those phases of the planning effort had a lot of contributions from the community. They were had their voice represented in each of those phases of the planning process. And so by the time we got to the Pocket Forest project, there was a lot of awareness and interest in the Pocket Forest projects and what it could do to enhance, the ecosystems and increase biodiversity in our areas. And we had a lot of community involvement and engagement in selecting the locations. Now, compared to Cambridge, we have a lot more underutilized open spaces that we could look at, but we did bring, community participants into the field to look at a handful of options. And, the selection was made as a result of those conversations that we had at the sites. And then we started working with the landowners and, figuring out logistics. And we have to date installed 5 pocket forests in the last 3 years.
So Beth, one thing I'm hearing both from you and Andrew is that your municipalities already had a plan or some kind of goal that fit with the mini forest. Is that by now true in most municipalities in our area? Or Anita's like, no, no way. And how important is that? Is that a place to start, like with your city's climate action
Yeah,
plan, tree equity plan, or?
right. I would say that not near all communities have climate action plans or sustainability coordinators or anything like that, but almost all communities are participating in the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program in Massachusetts. So it's a really good place to start by looking at the documents that came out of that planning process and see where there's alignment with your interests and the things that you might want to do about rewilding and enhancing ecosystems in your community. And then starting to talk to partners and people who, in the municipality and the people who also help to inform the plan and might be interested and have similar interests in what you're doing.
And I can give a slightly different, I'm going to take off my Planet Wild hat for this answer and put on my New York City hat. In New York City, trees are considered capital assets. Therefore, you use capital money for trees. And the city is about to announce its new canopy plan, which is 30%. We're at 22%, if I remember correctly. So it's a lot of ground to make up in a big city like New York City. And I know in that new urban forestry plan, which I'm not part of anymore, all my old colleagues are, and I read it, but I'm not officially part of it. They are building in microforests into that plan because they realized, just as well as I realized when I was still working there, that many of the open spaces left for these types of rewilding or restoration are smaller, compressed spaces and very dense urban sections. I'm not going to surprise everybody, mainly in poorer neighborhoods where there are environmental justice issues. And the microforest, and when I was still the chief in the city, microforests or forest in general were not considered as an appropriate way to address these compacted spaces, but they are now. And so I have a feeling that in the next couple of years, as that urban forest plan starts to roll out, particularly with city capital money, you'll see the foresters identifying spots for microforests and being able to use capital money to put them in neighborhoods, particularly the neighborhoods really that need them, that have low canopy cover compared to some of the wealthier neighborhoods, which have higher canopy cover. Again, that is not what I do now, but I did spend 28 years in New York City as the chief of forestry, so I have a good handle on it. And it does mean a lot, I should say, if a city or municipality is willing to make trees or plantings a capital asset, then you have access to capital money, which is always more plentiful than the expense money that cities use in many cases for tree planting. So if it becomes a capital asset, it's easier to make all these forest restorations happen.
I think that's a great insider tip. Uh, Thank you, Bram. But maybe one of you, Andrew, Beth, uh, can give a tip. If you are a citizen, how do you find out if this is in your municipality's planning, and how do you advocate? Uh, I'm sure every municipality is different, but is there a general pathway for advocacy?
I know that for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, almost every municipality has to have a tree warden that's usually in the Public Works Department. And what seems like a long time ago, members of Biodiversity for Local Climate reached out to the tree warden here to inquire about the possibility of planting a Miyawaki forest. And so sometimes it's just a title, and it's really just the director of the streets division of Public Works, but they should all have a tree warden, and that would be the person that, if it's under the Conservation Commission of your municipality, at least they'll know which direction to point a person into, or if there's already something in the works through a different organization of the municipality or something like that.
Well, I have one more question before I give Alex a chance to hop in here. Anita, as a resident who initiated a mini forest, I think you're in a position of a lot of our viewers. Hey, I'm a community member. I'd love to see a forest in my community. Where do I start? How do I get the agreement? And so we'd love to hear a little bit about your process and how you put your team together and got the support you needed.
Thanks. I feel really privileged to sort of represent the folks in the community who want to make this happen. I saw Shubhendu Sharma's TED Talk in 2021 maybe, and was just really attracted to the idea. By the way, Watertown is a place that has the energy and ecology plan, and was very, very supportive in our Miyawaki planting. But we also have a few very active groups. The Watertown Community Gardens is a very active group. And at one of our weeding events in 2022, I ran into a woman named Liza Ketchum, who happens to have co-authored a book on the Miyawaki Forest, the Miyawaki Method, that's going to be coming out in the spring next year, aimed at third to sixth graders. She and I were doing some weeding at a community garden, pollinator garden. And she said, what I really wish Watertown had was a Miyawaki forest. And I said, me too. So the two of us got together, and then we invited some people to join us. It was a very small core team, but Watertown Community Gardens was a big part of that. Trees for Watertown is another very important organization here, but the city itself had green infrastructure as a priority in the coming years. And they began looking at the Miyawaki Method as a thing, like, let's do a Miyawaki planting. So this trio, the city, the Watertown Community Gardens, who wanted to have some more garden plots, and our group, our small, let's make it happen, the Miyawaki Forest, yeah. We started looking for a site, and Watertown is also quite dense, and we finally landed on the bottom of a schoolyard. J.R. Lowell Elementary School had a vast schoolyard, and at the corner, very visible, right across from the DPW, the Department of Public Works, there was a great spot for considering doing both the Miyawaki Forest and a community gardens. So things just came together, but a real catalyst for us was that we happened to be in Watertown, which happens to have a Bosch company headquarters, and they have a Bosch Community Fund, and Trees for Watertown was invited to apply for a grant. And so our group, Forest for Watertown, had just come under the mother tree of Trees for Watertown because we needed to do some fundraising, and that was a 501c3 organization that could be our fiscal fund agent. So we had just come under their wing, and they said, "Hey guys, we don't really have a project. Why don't you propose your Miyawaki Forest?" So we got $25,000 as a grant from Bosch Community Funds. So I feel that in many ways, our particular effort was charmed. Not only that, but we have a lot of experts to call on. So I'll stop there.
So what I'm hearing is you started with the community group, right? You had to bring people together first to go to the city, which already had these goals in mind, and then you secured your funding and found your site. All right, that's a good plan. Just curious, was there any municipal funding included, or what kind of municipal support for the
It was
project?
a real collaboration, so that the city was giving a lot of in-kind. I would say that they doubled the value. So the city did a lot of site preparation, just a lot of, so I would say that the in-kind from the city plus the grant, it doubled what we were able to put into it. And I also just want to mention that our group, as it began, as it first formed, really wanted to learn along the way, to learn, to have the experience themselves and learn by doing, rather than say, oh, we're an organization and we're going to call in a consultation group and they'll make it happen and we'll be in the background getting the volunteers together and stuff. No, we wanted to learn the whole thing. So Shapendu Sharma's video series was very important to us. Hannah Lewis's book was very important to us. And a number of other organizations around the world had a lot of resources that we devoured.
Excellent. Anita, with all that planning and learning, are you planning to do more forests in your community?
What we want to do now, so we had a 2,000 square foot forest with all kinds of involvement of other collaborators. What we really want to do is find a way to make very small pocket forests interrupting, perforating the heat islands that are happening in some very, very dense areas of Watertown. And for that, we want to go into the we're planning this winter, fall and winter, to go into specific communities that are very impacted by heat islands and talk with the communities and see what their priorities are and bring in our partners, the city with its green infrastructure efforts, Watertown Community Gardens, Pollinator Pathways, and us, not just coming in saying, hey, how about this idea? But, what are you guys actually talking about? What are the big impacts that you're feeling? And just giving a little information about the health impacts of heat islands. We're really hoping that we can do much smaller scale plantings in those dense areas with the surrounding community happy to make it happen. And if nobody wants to do it, then we'll have a different approach next year.
Well, Anita, we know that anything we do in nature is a little bit of an experiment, and most of the people that we work with take a different path. They want to work with someone who has a little experience for their first time, and you've certainly met a lot of those experts. I'm already seeing in chat that people have different views on the do-it-yourself method. I'm not here to say which is the best, but if your forest is successful and beautiful and you're adding knowledge, then that's a great thing. You probably are interested in what Bram was talking about too, his microforests, which are much smaller than your average forest. So I imagine
Yes.
we'll be discussing. So
I do want to, we definitely leaned into experts from tree experts in our area, including Patrick Fairbairn, Peter Del Tredici, a number of experts in our area, and biodiversity for a livable climate has been a very important resource for us. So we just didn't want to sort of hire it out. We wanted to consult with people, but really do our part.
own the project, yes. Well, thank you for that shout out. We appreciate it. And that's when people look at Alexandra's role at Bio for Climate, it's not just planting forests, right? It's all that community support, the people who are always in touch with us, and we're pointing them to resources, giving information, doing free consultations. I'm not advertising that, short ones. So yeah, thank you. Uh, Another issue is where to get land. Almost every project I've seen has been some form of municipal land, like school or park land, but we also have some private land as well. And Bram, you've worked with a variety uh, of clients. Uh, why don't you start off with a little bit about how land is found for these projects?
Sure. Thanks for the question. I want to step back a little bit to answer that question. And I want to bring up Mel from the Aspetuck Land, Mary Ellen LeMay from the Aspetuck Land Trust. One of the reasons we sort of found each other is that like almost everybody on this conference, the the current metropolitan landscape doesn't yield a lot of space. The traditional land trust model was to find larger pieces of land, raise money to purchase it, and then also raise money to hire some crew that would take care of it over time. That land doesn't exist, at least in Westchester County and Fairfield County. I can't comment on Massachusetts and Pennsylvania as much, but I must imagine it's somewhat similar. And so Marianne LeMay was thinking through, like, how do you do conservation and restoration in this different context, as was I at Planet Wild. And in talking to each other and trying to address that particularly modern puzzle, we started to look at smaller spaces, both private and public, and I'll get to private in a second, at private and public spaces which were left, which were remnant spaces. And our approach to that opened up this new way of seeing the suburban context as legitimate for ecological restoration, because mostly it has not been considered legitimate. The suburbia has kind of been written off as this developed stripped mall place with a lot of private yards. As Doug was talking about before, most of this land is in private hands. So it seemed insurmountable. But yet at the same time, that's what we really need to deal with now. So for Aspetuck Land Trust, the Bridgeport grant that I talked about yesterday was one way to solve it. Through Planet Wild, since we are a for-profit company, in the last 2 years, when we meet with private clients that have reached out to us because they're interested in some way, they've read about, they've heard about, using their own land, which feels very empowering, using their own land to help either with the biodiversity crisis or the climate crisis. They're not mutually exclusive. We have been selling them more and more on microforests versus the meadows, which have been predominant for many private clients that we've dealt with. And that is starting to shift now on private land as we see people being attracted to the vertical look, being attracted to using forests as a way to shield themselves from the road or other neighbors. And also when we tell them how much easier over time a forest is to maintain, that has been persuading a lot of clients to start adopting forests as part of their restoration efforts and their insights. So now when we meet with clients, almost inevitably, we bring up microforest first, unless the configuration of their land just doesn't allow it. But if it does, we always start off with microforests, and more people are open to our argument that that's the best way to address restoration and environmental benefits and services on their land. So that's one of the ways that we've gone about finding the right land for these microforests and then connecting them, as Doug was talking about earlier. Because when one neighbor does it, we have discovered other neighbors are starting to become more and more interested in what's happening. You still have some traditional reactions, which are people saying, what are you doing there? I just want to see that flat green emerald lawn. But that is shifting and we can feel it shifting. So I hope that answers the question.
That's really helpful. I'm going to just have a couple more questions I'm going to look at from the chat for this first phase initiation, and then we'll move on to planning your forest. The first one we haven't really touched on a lot in this conference, and yet it's really critical. And this comes from Judith Black about integrating these forests into social justice neighborhoods, low income, environmental equity, those considerations. In previous administrations, having projects that had a direct impact on the people who needed it most in the urban heat islands, low canopy, was a high priority. But as our questioner Judith points out, every foot of space in these areas is often used to try to create economic development or provide services, or is covered with concrete. Does anyone have any experience or thoughts about how you integrate or find space or really deal with getting these forests into those communities?
Let me just answer quickly. I do not want to hog the time, but I just want to say quickly that in New York City, it comes from policy. And in New York City, there's now an urban heat island initiative. It is a policy that comes from the mayor and that was voted by the city council. So if it becomes a law, and in this case, it is using several different mechanisms to address urban heat island, which in New York City, I don't know the stats for other cities, but more people die of heat exposure and stroke than they do of storms, even though Hurricane Sandy is more dramatic. The storms are more dramatic. And so now that it's law, that means there's money available and communities can advocate to their local council members to go into that pot of capital money to do forests and to design and build forests in their neighborhood. So having it be a policy in your municipality usually leads to a budget, which means that you can access it if you have local political advocacy. And I'll just stop there.
There's politics. Andrew, when you and we chose the locations for some of our forests, we did take into consideration which communities would benefit. Do you want to just say a couple words about that?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple different things that are driving equitable distribution of canopy through Cambridge. A lot of that is Resiliency Cambridge, which was a plan that was developed for climate resiliency, and then the Urban Forestry Master Plan, and it looked at cooling areas and most at-risk populations. And so using that data from those data sets has informed locations that are in need of not only just shade and the cooling benefits of a microforest, but species diversities and things like that. And so the way that Cambridge is set up is using that data, we're allowed to sort of target the locations. Green and Rose is a great example of a neighborhood that is canopy deficient with what the city calls at risk or populations. And so that does definitely inform our locations. I try not to even look at locations that are like have a surplus of over 30% canopy in Cambridge. We try to target the areas that are most prone to heat island and heating and things like that. And that's all data driven in the city.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So the last question is a question I saw come up and that I also hear all the time. A couple of the key, my initial conversations with people almost always come down to maintenance and spread. And people don't believe that there's no maintenance after 3 years. And people are concerned that the little spot that you've designated that, in the way of nature, these forests are going to spread out into park space or other spaces. How do you address those concerns? And who wants to go first? Andrew, I'm going to come back to you, because what I tell people when I'm advocating is you need to have your DPW talk to Andrew Putnam in Cambridge and get the straight scoop, because I'm an advocate. You're never going to believe me. I'm always going to tell you it's going to be great, right? And that these folks need to talk to each other. What do you say, in all honesty, to address those concerns?
I just speak from sort of our short-lived experience with the Miyawaki method and some growing pains that we went through at Danahy specifically. But we really try to plant the last two that we've done. We try to plant like very densely to try to help just even suppress weed growth more. And then I get into some of the more technical, like fungal ratio of the soil to suppress your typical weed growth. And then in our experience, it's been once and sometimes the following growing season that we'll go through and do some light weeding, especially on the perimeter edge of the forest where we do get some creep in. And then just the maintenance is somewhat hands off after that in terms of the natural cycle of the forest. So just 5 years of experience, our plan moving forward about what that will look like is sort of how I phrase it towards people. I mean, we've had varying successes with weeding and things like that, but the density has really kept that down, and appropriate soil prep. So that I sort of phrase it just from our own experience of how we've been handling it, how we plan to manage it in the future, and what's been working. And just also, I kind of reiterate how excited volunteers have been. And so to get a group of people together, Danahy's been weeded several times, but it's not a heavy lift for some of the same people who came and planted or installed the forest to come back and do weeding and continue caretaking at the location.
Well, we do have another section to talk about maintenance and what happens afterwards, but
Yep.
It's interesting that's a consideration in the very beginning when you're pitching the forest.
Yeah, it definitely comes up quite a bit. Just the process of it, the density and things like that, and overall maintenance.
Well, thank you. Alexandra, I think the preparation and planting is your area, particularly when we start to talk about the planting list and soil prep. So I'll let you ask those questions.
So I'm deeply honored that I've had the chance to learn directly from Walter. And I would like to take this opportunity to discuss, all the planting list, potential natural vegetation, how to create a planting list, all of that. And I would like to start with the question, when we are beginning to think about a site and to understand it, what are the sources available to find out what kind of plant communities occur in the area? And secondly, when visiting local plant communities, and that this is part of the method to shape what the forest should contain and envision what it might look in the future, what has been your experience in conducting this essential task? How important is it to physically visit this existing forest community to gain this embodied knowledge? How does establishing this direct relationship with the forest go beyond simply creating a planting list? And why is learning from and emulating a forest community so critical for the success of a mini forest project? And you can tell the whole story and your process here as someone who has had, over 40, 50 years of experience of engaging with the forest communities in Massachusetts, and feel free to touch upon soil preparation as well, although I have a few questions about that too.
You
So
have a whole hour or two for me.
you can take a whole chunk of this section, given that you haven't talked at all in the first phase, Walter.
Okay.
So this is your stage.
So the first thing that I encounter as an ecological advisor is, of course, what is the mindset of the people who are doing the planning? And most people's experiences are of cultivated landscapes and as gardeners. So there is usually a learning curve to get people on board thinking about the ecology and the ecological approach to these forests. And one of the things that I always say to people is, first we're going to look at all the abiotic factors in your site. So what is the geology, the topography, hydrology, soils, all of these factors that go into making what's possible to grow there. And once we have some information from that, we go and look and whatever remnant, especially in urban areas, you're looking at remnant pieces of forest to try to glean some kind of information of what might have grown there in the past. And then from that information, trying to assess, well, what kind of community belongs here? What kind of community would thrive here? And the important thing to know here is that every state and province in North America has a classification of community types. And so you really need to go and understand those and look at them in terms of what is possible, because you want ecological coherence in your site. A lot of times I have to do a little pushback with people because they're like, oh, but I like this plant. And I'm like, well, but does that plant go in this kind of community in nature? And as often as not, they're like, well, no. So one of the things that we do is we go out and look at sites that, and this is part of the Miyawaki method, is go out and look at sites that you think would be appropriate in nature. And we did this for the most recent one. We're doing one at Belmont High School. And it's in a very flat plain with very little vegetation left. It's, next to a high school. And after looking at all the abiotic factors, we thought, well, this looks like a wetland. It floods, but not very often. And from that description, the only kind of habitat that I could see that it could possibly be was a high terrace floodplain forest, which is a long name for a community. So we found some, and I've seen some of these myself. And then we went to one as a group. And I think this is really essential. If you're going to plant this, you should go look at these natural forests, because when you're standing in them, you have the feeling of what they will become, what they should be. You get to see the actual plants interacting and growing. And you get to see all these other factors of the soils and topography. And this really informs what you can do. And from that, we developed, actually, there are lists with these state classifications. So we already know what is expected to be found in these. Now, not every single species is going to be found in any given site, but we looked at what was there, compared it to the list of what has been found in various different ones. And with my own experience of these forests, we were able to come up with a list for this kind of community type. And now we have a very tight, coherent ecological planting to do. So that's a long move on to the next questions.
Thank you so much, Walter. Yeah, I feel like it's so important to communicate the importance of actually going to the forest community, but also I find that to what Anita was speaking earlier, to resources like a forest or the book, there is nothing more important in this process than the embodied knowledge. And I feel like you are a living representation of embodied knowledge. So we must come to you and then go to the forest, because there is nothing that can ever replace, no book, no resource, no playlist of YouTube videos that can ever replace the embodied knowledge that forms over time. And that's why we must consult the ecologists and botanists that, like you, that have had the chance to form this understanding over time. So thank you for that.
Can I raise an issue?
Sure.
And of course, I agree with Walter that you need to go back to the past. And as an ecologist, I believe in that deeply, and it is the right way to start. But you also have to counterbalance that, once again, going back to my New York City time, you also have to counterbalance that with what's actually going to work in those places.
Mhm.
So we
Yeah.
would start with lists that would go back hundreds, thousands of years. We knew the ecosystems, there's relatively good data on it. But then over time, we started to see what species were working and which were not. And our lists were refined over time to those species, which are still a lot of species, but not as many as it existed there 500 years ago. Let's just
Yeah.
use that date. Because otherwise, if you're using capital money for something like this, you don't get that capital money back if things die off. So you really are looking for that balance between what is historically, ecologically appropriate, but what's actually going to survive, particularly conditions in New York City, and particularly if you're planting in some of the denser areas in Manhattan and Brooklyn. So those were questions as natural resource managers in New York City we had to balance. And I'm still doing that at Planet Wild and in suburbia, although I have more space to go deeper into the ecological past and try species that we hope would work because they were there a couple hundred years ago, because there's a different environment, not the same latitude to experiment if I was planting on Columbus Circle, 59th Street and Broadway, which I have done. So I think it depends where you are and what circumstances you're facing, because you do want your plants to survive and thrive over time.
And
I
I'll
think
also,
this, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to also comment because we definitely, want to take a rigorous ecological approach, but we also are working within community and have partners in the project, and the maintenance and the success rates and things like that are considered, but also just what the interests are from our partners. And we're working at 3 schools, and we're interested in things that would help to engage the students. And we have a partner with the United Native American Cultural Center, so we also wanted to reach out to them and see what stories would help them tell cultural stories, or I'm sorry, what plants would help them tell cultural stories, and make it more interesting and help them to engage with the public about their mission as well. And so there's a lot of factors that go into it, and we in terms of the ecological expertise and things like that, we were really lucky to work with Casey Lee, who had a strong presence at the workshops yesterday, so we definitely were able to hear from him and his perspective. And then, many factors come into play in terms of the selection of the plant list and the layout, the design. We spent a lot of time just thinking about layout of these sites. But I think, number of factors and, hearing from the community and their interests, for us was also an important piece. So,
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that, obviously you would need a baseline to start from, but this is still an experimental forest that everybody is putting together. And there is, of course, leeway. I think we've always looked at what other possibilities can you have, in terms of what is there, what is the community looking at and needing too. And this is part of this discussion about successional species, because even in mature forests, I'm always finding successional species there, and they are adding a great deal of value, even in low numbers. So we look at the Ptolemy's list, and poplars and willows are very high up there, even though they're early successional species. So I think there is a lot of room for, working with the community and with the site as to, what the actual final planting list is. But I do think that the majority should still have coherence. Otherwise, we're not trying to do restoration, we're gardening.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's something I've learned from Walter in this process. And it's very interesting, like when you're starting to look at the forest community, something that emerged in our discussions is that even within a particular forest community, you can have a certain ratio of shrubs to trees that is different among other forest communities. And I think also what I'm hearing too is that we as humans, when we are trying to do a Miyawaki forest within a broader social ecological context, there's the client that must be satisfied, and there's the community that must be satisfied, and on top of all of this is actually how nature works. So I think it's like a very interesting balance, but I think something also that emerged in my conversation with Walter is when making a decision about the planting list or soil preparation, or it's like under what ecological principle are you making that decision? And I do not have an answer to that, but as someone with with a background in just like biomimicry, or always going back to how nature works, I think that is a question I'll always ask in the process. And I think it's a good, I don't know, just criteria to take under consideration. I have another question about plants before I go into soil preparation. Walter, also for you, using local ecotypic plants is part of the method, and maybe you can define what that means. But sourcing them from available nurseries is usually not possible. What models could we use to grow them? What partnerships can be established, such as partnering with nurseries to source seeds and help with growing or beyond? Because we do need the plants, and we do need, maybe like to Prasada's point earlier, those genetics and diversity of genetics, because that adds to the overall resilience of the system. Yeah.
Well, it's part of the Miyawaki method to propagate local eco races. And this takes time, and you really need to have some sources that are doing this. Because native plant growing is fairly new, there aren't a lot of nurseries out there growing plants, and most of them don't tell you what their sources are. And so you're just dependent on them. The largest one in Massachusetts is the New England wetlands plants in Western Mass. And we don't know where they source their plants. As a nurseryman, I try to grow my own and try to source as locally as possible, but there are a lot of species that I can't get. And if I buy from some nursery, I have no idea. They won't or don't know where their material comes from. So I'm thinking forward, that we need to develop some kind of model, since we're planting more and more of these forests, which is wonderful. But we also need to think about how can we source this local eco-race species that are going to be more well adapted to the local region. And I don't have any, as a grower, I do my part and I train people, trying to get more people to do this. But all of the growers, we all agree that we simply cannot keep up with just the general public demand for plants, let alone these Miyawaki forests, which use huge numbers of plants, and no one's growing them to that scale.
I've been hearing, that some states do have state nurseries to grow native plants, and I would love for those kinds of conversations to really start more, like that we can really look to collaborate and ask for more support at the state level, for these types of things, because it just takes enough people and enough interest and energy towards it, and we might be able to get somewhere.
So the New Hampshire State Forestry Nursery produces wonderful plants. The demand for their plants is so huge that you have to be on their website the day they open it, or they run out. And they only carry so many different species, so you can only source so many from them. But ideally, I would love to see the state of Massachusetts also does this. I don't know where the impetus would come for them to get increased funding to do more than they do now, because they do a really great job.
And in my experience, what's moved the dial is government investment and commitment. The Million Trees campaign in New York City, which I oversaw, I had $40 million in my budget for plants because we knew that enough plants were not going to be available. And so we got to write our own specifications, but we then had $10 million contracts over 9 years with about 7 nurseries in the area. And we supplied the native seed, but we then said, you need to grow from it. And if they wanted the contract with us, they had to commit to it. And so it was programs, it was the Million Tree program in particular, but it was government investment that allowed us to shift the supply chain towards away from a kind of random amount of native plants that you could get. You had no idea what their provenance was, and that was, that's just what you had to deal with at the marketplace. But having that kind of government investment through a program, in the city case, is a big deal. And now that I'm in Westchester and I'm on the board of the Hilltop Hanover Farm, we got the County of Westchester to commit to a native plant seed collection, cleaning, and propagation program. And then that material goes out to environmental organizations for free. And that is a government subsidy, but it's coming because there is a lot of demand for it within the region. And I was able to play a role and say that this can work. And so now you can come and get seed or even small plugs from Hilltop Hanover Farm. They're not unlimited, so you have to sign up. But a lot of environmental organizations are now coming to the farm to get the seed. The last part is 2 years ago, there's a $4.2 billion bond act that was voted in New York State. And the state is at least saying, they have not yet committed, but they are saying that they're going to commit $200 million towards supporting regional native plant supply chains, as well as seed collections and nurseries. So I only think the supply chain is going to change if there is a government commitment to it on a larger scale than just one particular program or one particular planting. I don't think private nurseries are going to make that change unless the demand is so overwhelming, but the demand can be funneled through government investment. So that's just my particular experience, but I do think that that can work, but you have to have the local government be willing to commit to it and see it as something that's valuable. They're not going to invest in it if they don't see it as valuable.
Graham, I just want to jump in. I'm
Yeah.
so curious how you got the seed collection to happen, because my understanding from readings and so forth is that seed harvesting locally is one of the big stumbling blocks. And then along with that, I'm also kind of wondering, I think Catherine asked a question in the chat, how long does it take for, say, our Miyawaki forest to produce what would be considered local climate information seed kind of thing? So couldn't we start harvesting within our Miyawaki forests?
I'm not a seed collector. I'm not a botanist, so I don't want to say anything that is incorrect. The way seed collection works, only in my experience, was that since I was overseeing the Greenbelt Native Plant Center as part of my job in New York City, the seed collectors were given permits through state agencies and city agencies to collect on their land. They would not have given it to any individual. They were only giving it to us because we were part of the government system. Then we would follow the Seeds of Success protocols. Seed of Success is a program through the Bureau of Land Management that have protocols for collecting seed. And you have to be very careful. You can't over-collect, because then you could sabotage existing and thriving communities. So it was only people that went through this protocol that could collect. And then once they came back to the nursery, it was a mixture of establishing these founder plots. I don't want to get too technical about it, but we were able, and then the same process at Hilltop, which is in Westchester. And that is because we're government sponsored, we can get permit for collecting and all these regional, municipal, and state lands, but you have to follow these protocols. Otherwise, you're going to put existing wild communities at risk, which is why not anyone can just say, hey, I'd like a permit for collecting, because you could sabotage or undermine the ecosystem. So you do need to know what you're doing. So it does require a system that's amenable to that, and then you sort of can push it in a certain direction. But my sense is that where you all exist, which is in the Northeast here, that there are municipal governments and state governments that are probably open to this. They just have to understand the value of ecotypical plants. And if they don't, then they're not going to express interest. And that comes from good old-fashioned advocating and education and speaking to local politicians about the value of ecotypical plants versus just wherever you get a goldenrod. It might have been grown in Oregon, but if it says it's native to this area, that's what you get on the market. And I'm not poo-pooing that, right, at all, because one has to deal with the realities of our world, but there is a greater push now for ecotypical plants.
I can speak to this as an individual nurseryman and a botanist and ecologist. I go to organizations and ask them if I can collect plants to make herbarium specimens, but also collect seed for growing. And it's part of the collecting protocol. We tell them up front, this is what we do and how we do it. And one of those things is we never take more than 10% of seed of any population. And I'm able to get these permits because I do surveys and give them something back in terms of information and also advice on managing the properties. And so I'm able to collect a certain amount of seed, but it requires knowledgeable people. You can't just have anybody going out. And then there's the other issue we run into, which of course is things like oaks that only mass fruit every so often. So collecting seed is it's a difficult endeavor because I do a lot of it, but I think that I agree with you, we need to have some form of organizational collecting where it's government sponsored or sponsored by, conservation organizations, so that we can increase the amount of seed available to the growers. And I know other growers have been doing the same thing that I've been doing, but again, it's much too small a scale. We need to scale this all up.
And you can see that Koki, in his response, he was saying he does 5% max. We have followed the 10% rule ourselves, and I think that's how the Seeds of Success program, which you should all look into, which has helped establish national protocols for seed collection. I think that was 10% if I'm right, but I think depends where you are and depends on the state of your existing ecosystems. If they're fragile, or if they're on the edge, or if they're too small, 10% might be too much, because you don't want to undermine the existing ecosystems for seed collection purposes. But you'd have to know your area and know those spaces where seed collecting is taking place.
And there's another issue here too, which is rescuing. So a lot of times we know that an area is going to be developed or a dam's going to be rebuilt, and we get a permit to go in and rescue plants or collect all the seed. And a similar issue is the deer pressure is so high in some areas that even though you might get a whole area of little oak seedlings, the next year they're all gone. So, you're kind of like, are you going to do an intervention here? And at what level? And so there are multiple factors to be considered.
Throughout this process, I have heard a couple of people mention ground covers and say, oh, it was very helpful in their project. And I don't know that we've used ground covers. Is ground covers a part of the method? And what are the advantages or disadvantages?
We have been adding some ground cover to our pocket forest. So we've used strawberries and a couple of vines, and things like the fuzzy bean and Virginia creeper and things like that. So we like to try and establish a little bit more, protection of the ground so that the weeds don't come in. We have had a lot of pressure from invasive species, particularly mugwort and spotted knapweed. And so we've just felt like adding, these ground cover plants in that interim until we get more shade coverage has been, a strategy that we're trying. And it just helps make the pocket forest more interesting as well. We have added some seeds of other herbaceous plants, more of like the pollinator type things, again, for that interim and transition, just to, add the interest and the pollinator resources until, more things start flowering.
And at Planet Wild, we always use ground covers for the same reason that you just described, as well as giving a sort of border to the microforest that is both ornamental. I mean, we're using only native ground cover, but that's both native, but also demarks the edges of the microforest so people can see it more clearly, as well as a weed suppressant.
So, Brim, that's internally and around the edges as a border?
Only around the edges.
Okay.
We not use ground cover internally, just around the edges of the microforest.
Walter, do you have any thoughts on that?
The Miyawaki forest is supposed to be so densely shaded that not much other than maybe some ground covers could occur in them. I do wonder about the use of Virginia creeper, which is so aggressive in climbing the trees and shrubs. I'd be curious to know how much management that requires to keep them from overtaking the young forest, although they do make a wonderful ground cover in and of themselves.
Yeah.
I like the idea of putting the edging around the outside to define it, and to whatever extent that ground cover could, move inside. At Danahy, we saw a non-native ground cover, ground ivy, doing just this. It'd be better if it was, self-heal or something else, but.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the alternative is that we're using heavy mulching to suppress weeds. So
yeah,
kind of a green mulch versus brown mulch situation.
Right.
One of the things we'll be exploring in the Watertown forest is that I do think we want to try some ground cover that would start going in, but the border idea is to block the wind so that it doesn't dry out the floor of the forest. And that may not be a pollinator garden. I saw someone mentioning that for the Belmont a project going on, that we were talking about a pollinator garden there, and they said after looking at the aforest videos and the discussion about the mantle, the surround of the forest, after the forest is established, then put in some native plants that will block the wind and give that a little less, more barrier, and demarcate edge of the forest. So in the Belmont project, they're saying now we're going more for the wind blocking, and the pollinator garden will be nearby. So that function that they talk about in Shupendu Sharma's videos series, that's to, like, we don't see that in our forests today because it's all trampled down and so forth. But in the ancient forests, there would be this sort of fringe, and it would have the effect of blocking the wind. And in our case, catching all that litter and paper that blows from all the stuff.
Yeah,
All right.
I also think of the transition zone in the mantle as being composed by the shrubs too, which in a forest community, like the way I'm thinking about the planting layout right now is where the shrubs are going. So I think for the Belmont group, we are gonna have the that color, but like on the edges, our planting list is categorized on like the edge species. So there will be, I think, even when I am thinking about the layout, I'm mostly thinking about like some plants will be randomly distributed, but some need to go exactly where they need to go because they are an edge species. And if I'm putting them in the center, that means I'm just I'm not caring for their long-term success. Yeah, it's been interesting to think about, like, when you're doing the categorization of the planting list, there's just so many categories that you can, like, we have a species on our planting list that's a nitrogen fixer, and that's an early successional species, the alder, and we're evenly distributing throughout the forest.
Any other, anything else to add around maintenance?
I'll say just very quickly, our group is using master gardeners for our first year because we do want to have excellent weeding and very careful. We have many very young plants, so we want to be very careful about not removing plants by accident and having people who are very careful. I hope that later we will open it up to more community involvement.
We do get questions. Thank you, Anita. We do get questions. Well, I'm just looking over here about community. You're using professionals when you do incorporate communities. Any best practices so that they're trained on the difference between the weeds and the plants, not trampling on what's in there. How big of an issue is that, and how do you deal with it?
We have had a lot of community involvement, in our pocket forest, and we certainly have had some damage for the tiny seedlings and things like that. So it's a balance. We, certainly have wanted some of the help with, in some cases we're doing like a cut and drop. We don't really want to disturb the soil system, so we'll cut some weeds, drop them, create, that green mulch, with the stalks and things like that. It's definitely about teaching people what the problematic plants are, which ones we're going to leave because we know they're annuals and they're occupying a space and we're okay with that. But it's really about looking at making sure that light is able to reach all of the seedlings and the target, woody plants and things like that we want to be able to thrive and grow. And, going out and just assessing and seeing where we want some assistance with maintenance. We have paths and, like a big open classroom space in one of our pocket forests that has the paw print shape. So the 8th graders had designed the site and settled on a panther paw print. So we've got a big outdoor classroom space in the middle of the paw print. And so we do have more edges as well for, a number of our pocket forests, and have had, some of these weedy species that we're just keeping an eye on and maintaining as needed. But certainly letting people know what the invasives are and the ones that we absolutely do want to pull. And, it's a balance because we have really prioritized the community engagement and getting people excited about these projects. And when they were at the, the really large, well-attended planting days, we had 400 students plant our middle school pocket forest over the course of 2 days. And they come out and they monitor and they help spread mulch in the outdoor classroom space. And, so it's really, sort of a passion project as well. So it is, it is a balance, and we do recognize that we'll have, the loss of some of our shrubs. Hopefully they'll grow back, with new shoots after, a stalk might be broken off. But, we just consider that part of, what is happening within our project.
Thank you so much, Beth. I'm gonna, one of these questions from Catherine Alexander. How are the forests protected over time? And I think a couple other people also asked, especially zoning, any kinds of, trusts, or how do you know that it won't become a parking lot in 5 or 10 years or 20?
It has to be embedded in the community from the very beginning. They're the ones who are going to protect it. No outsider is going to protect it in the same way that people in the community are going to. And if it's meaningful to them, that can even be passed along the generations. And so both working in Bridgeport and in Norwalk, Connecticut, the community participation was built in from the very beginning of these projects. It's not a guarantee. I'm not saying it's going to be, but to me, that is the most likely way to have long-term success.
I want to wrap up a last section here on education. Yesterday, we heard some great stories on education from the Aspetuck Land Trust and the work with schools. And Beth, you also work with schools. Maybe as a recap for people, or a few best practices that you'd like to share as to how these forests become part of educational programs.
All right, well, just one plug that I would love to continue the conversation with anyone who's working with mini forests and school environments or educational environments. I think that, we all can really learn a lot from each other. We have been working with particularly an 8th grade science teacher who's been working on this project from the very beginning, and she's just been amazing to partner with, and she's developing some lesson plans for us, which we'll be able to share. But I think it's interesting because so many teachers don't have a lot of experience with working with outdoor education and bringing students outside. And so I want to think about what we can continue to do at the schools that we're engaging with to support the teachers and get them educated and made more aware of the opportunities to engage the student in long-term monitoring and activities associated with using this amazing outdoor classroom laboratory that they now have access to. I think at the high school, where we also have installed a pocket forest just this spring, we're looking to partner with the environmental science class, and I was really happy to hear about the coordination that some of the other projects are doing in that regard. So I look forward to reaching out and trying to share more ideas there as well. But I just think, just the opportunities to engage students and teachers with these pocket forests are really tremendous. And 3 of our 5 pocket forests are associated with schools. And, we're just really looking forward to continuing those relationships and building those opportunities.